Without a doubt, Donald Trump's threat to Canada's sovereignty and economy have been having reverberations on the federal political scene right here in Canada. Recent polls having the Conservative lead dwindle to single digits, most notably when Mark Carney is floated as Justin Trudeau's successor. And as a result, we've seen a refocusing of the Conservative message, one that is more nationalist with sharper words for the perceived frontrunner in the Liberal race.
Mark Carney took his headquarters out of Canada. The media has been covering this up. The first thing he did after Trump won re-election was to take his headquarters, his corporate headquarters, and send it to New York. So he doesn't have to pay all the taxes that he and Mr. Trudeau have been imposing on business here in Canada. I will do the exact opposite of Carney. I will bring the jobs home to this country and put our country first.
Well, to talk about this, we're now joined by Susan Smith, former Liberal strategist, now principal and co-founder of Blue Sky Strategy Group. Jordan Paquet is a former Conservative strategist, now a vice president with Blue Sky Strategy Group. And George Soule, a former director of communications for the NDP, currently managing a local campaign in the Ontario election, not with Blue Sky Strategy Group. So, hello to the three of you.
Thanks for the plug, Michael. Appreciate that.
You're very welcome. So listen, okay, so
See me later.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so listen, you have now Pierre Poilievre making these comments, and really these are the types of words you usually hear once a leader is chosen. But he's launching this, I guess, attack campaign against Mr. Carney even before Liberals vote. What does that tell you about how worried Conservatives are right now about Mark Carney potentially winning the Liberal race?
Well, it tells me they're very worried. We're seeing polling trends. The important poll is the election day poll, but we've seen a massive drop in Conservative support, a big uptick in Liberal support, particularly when the question is posed with Mr. Carney as the leader. And what Mr. Poilievre is very worried about is that Mark Carney is known as an economist, former governor of the Bank of Canada, former governor of the Bank of England, someone who's been an official at finance, who knows how economies work, who's participated in the global economy. And Mr. Poilievre doesn't stack up from his experience in that perspective. And Mr. Carney is pulling the people away from the Conservatives, the more moderate folks, the people who were definitely done with Prime Minister Trudeau and done with the Liberals as a result, but hadn't fully made up their minds. Now they have something to focus on, someone they can trust, an adult in the room. And it goes to, is the ballot question going to be about who can best manage Trump and the economy? And that's the biggest concern for Mr. Poilievre, because that's where he doesn't stack up against Mr. Carney, and that's why he's going after him.
Okay, well, it's interesting you say that, because Conservatives still make the argument affordability is still the #1 issue. But he is now coming out very strongly, Pierre Poilievre, coming out very strongly against Mark Carney. Is he worried?
I don't know if it's so much of a worry. I mean, look, it's the Conservatives are still close to majority territory in the polls. They're still hovering up there. We've seen the Liberal numbers move a little bit. That's naturally going to happen when there's a leadership race and when activities happen, when Trump's attacking the country. There's going to be some of those nationalistic tendencies that are going to move numbers. But at the same time, Canadians they know of Mark Carney. They've heard the name before. They've seen him as, governor of the Bank of Canada, Bank of England. They've heard the name, but they don't actually know him and what he stands for and what his politics are. So I think these attacks that the Conservatives are doing right now is trying to draw out some of these policies. We don't know exactly where he stands on any number of key issues because he hasn't put out a ton of policy yet. The Conservatives are just slogans. They've been putting out most of the same thing lately. So I feel like some of it's that is to really try and wedge them into a corner and start talking about where they're at in some of these key issues.
Okay, so what do you make of it, George? Is Pierre Poilievre worried about Mark Carney?
I think he has to be. The last thing I want to do is say that Mark Carney's good for the country, because I'm going to stick with my party. Thank you very much. But I will say that a lot of the pushback we've seen over the years has really been directed specifically at Justin Trudeau. I mean, we all know the flags, and I mean, frankly, even the slogans. And Pierre Poilievre has been attacking Justin Trudeau very specifically. So with him gone, Mark Carney's now attempting to kind of say, "You want to change? I can be that change." Pierre Poilievre's angle has been for so long, we want to have a carbon tax election. And, you can choose to believe or not believe Mark Carney as much as you want, but Mark Carney is saying that he's going to get rid of the carbon tax. So the carbon tax is now off the table. And so they've had to pivot. What I find the most interesting is why the Conservatives are denying the pivot. I mean, I think it's totally fair. They held a massive rally in front of a big Canadian flag again, and like changing the whole new message. And instead of admitting that they're strategically smart and they're moving forward with a new message, they're trying to deny it. And I think that's a bit of a strange tactic.
Yeah, I wonder if the message has changed enough, though, too, right? Because, beforehand we were looking at things like Canada is broken, fix the budget. And today there's a sign in front of Pierre Poilievre, fix the broken budget. So is really the message changing that substantially to kind of rebuild the numbers that they've lost to the Liberals in the last few weeks?
Well, Mr. Poilievre doesn't like to admit that he's wrong, and he would have to step away from all the footage where he's been Captain Canada is broken. That's what he's been telling people for 2 years, and he's got to try to pivot, and that was about that fully staged rally. Only about 500 people, by the way. Mr. Carney's been drawing more than that.
Yeah,
but he's... Sorry.
I was there.
You were there. Okay.
Yeah.
Mr. Poilievre has a lot of Axe the Tax T-shirts, so he's got to get some mileage out of that. But he's trying to pivot from Canada is broken to maybe something else, because Mr. Carney has been associated with building budgets. But Poilievre is going to have a hard time sticking things on Mark Carney. And the worse Mr. Trump behaves, and the more nervous that Canadians get about the country and what Mr. Trump is going to do to our economy with tariffs, the worse it is for Pierre Poilievre. And the more people will be looking to what the alternatives are. As I said, you can't go from saying for 2 years Canada's broken to I'm Captain Canada now. It doesn't work. Canadians aren't foolish.
Well, will this kind of change in direction work? Because, again, it's a melding of two former phrases as opposed to a wholesale change.
Fair, but Mark Carney's been the Liberal economic advisor since 2020. They made this big production about rolling him out as such. So now he's trying to run away from the Liberal record because it's unpopular. This is a guy that did stand up for carbon price for the long time and said, if you don't believe in carbon pricing, then you don't believe in climate change, and basically, you're bad for the environment. So they're going to still have an issue getting away from this. Sure, the Axe the Tax message. I don't think people were ever going to walk into the ballot box and just mark something about the carbon tax. It comes down to the affordability in general, and the carbon tax was just one aspect of that. There's going to be other elements of carbon pricing that he's already talked about in certain sectors. And I mean, he's saying one thing in BC and another thing in Quebec. So their campaign team admitted just recently that they got to tighten up their messaging. So once they actually get into the debates next week, it's going to be really interesting because we haven't seen him tested yet. We haven't seen him really, really pressed hard on questioning. And when he is, for that one example last week in CBC, he sort of struggled with it a little bit. So we're going to see what happens come the debate times. I think Christopher Fillion will come out and challenge him very hard. But that'll be the first kind of preview to see how he will manage himself.
Yeah, and the debates are next week. The French one Monday, the English one Tuesday. George, I kind of wonder though. Mr. Carney now gets all this criticism in these Conservative ads. Is he vulnerable to the criticisms being raised, advising the Trudeau government in the past, with moving corporate headquarters for a company he worked with? Is he vulnerable to these criticisms?
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting to watch the Liberals and the Conservatives fight over who's less in touch with Canadian people overall. And Mark Carney obviously also advised Stephen Harper and the late Jim Flaherty, and was lauded as such. He's obviously somebody who's got a lot of corporate banking experience. And I think what people are going to have to see is whether or not he's actually relatable to them in their daily lives. That's something that Pierre Poilievre has struggled with as someone who's lifelong career as a member of Parliament. And Mark Carney, again, doesn't really live the life that most of us live day to day. So I think that's where they're going to have that problem. And that's still the place where I think, the NDP and Jagmeet have traditionally had a role, and hopefully that's where they can punch through. But I do think that, to Susan's point, it was easy for the Conservatives, as they always do, to say Canada's broken, nothing's working. But as soon as we got Trump attacking us and Canadians unified and gained this sense of pride in our country in a way that we rarely do, that was another reason that Pierre Poilievre really had to shift their message. The Conservatives can't just go into this election saying things are broken, we're going to fix it. This level of pride in our country is sort of unprecedented for us, and so it's going to make everybody have to adjust.
Yeah, everyone have to adjust, but again, I'm Conservatives do hope that Mark Carney is vulnerable to the criticisms being raised.
Sure, absolutely. And I mean, listen, the Conservatives haven't had to pivot that much. I mean, we've been talking about the same thing since the first Trump term. I can remember Ronna Ambrose standing up in the House of Commons and pushing Justin Trudeau at the time and saying, what are you going to do to make our own economy more resilient? How are we going to reduce intertrade barriers? How are we going to reduce taxes, attract investment back? Here we are in now the second Donald Trump term after another Democratic term, and we're caught having these same arguments again. So at least Conservatives have been consistent since then. I think it's the Liberals that are trying to really play catch-up right now with themselves.
Okay, last word, Susan.
Interprovincial trade's been an issue for a long, long time. Remember when James Moore was the minister, I was helping generate stories so that the minister would have something to talk about and be able to rally the premiers on that. So that's not new. Mr. Poilievre thinks by putting on a red tie and standing in front of a Canadian flag, people are going to believe he's Captain Canada. He's going to have to do more than that. Mr. Carney has not been tested on a political stage, but he's been tested as governor of the bank, multiple central banks, with tough questions in tough economic times. So I think the debates next week will be very interesting. I hope there's not a Liberal bloodletting. I hope we don't create cannon fodder for the opposition parties. Sometimes people get a bit carried away, but I think it's going to be interesting. He's not a slogan guy. That's not his thing. He's not a quippy guy. That's not his thing. He's an economist. Right at this point in time in Canada, that's what we need. We need someone smart, someone serious, someone experienced who can handle the economy domestically, internationally, and set the country on the right path.
Okay.
Michael Ignatieff 2.0, yeah. We needed an academic at that time. And,
Not academic, he's had real-world experience, which Pierre has not.
You know, George, sometimes there's an advantage of being in Oshawa. Just saying.
Again, who's more out of touch? It's hard to tell between those two. We'll see.
Okay. Well, we're watching. Susan, Jordan, George, thank you very much for the time.